Margaret Whitmore had heard the whispers before they even began. She could feel them in the sideways glances at the hardware store, in the way her neighbors smiled too politely when she hauled another load of timber past their pristine lawns. At 63, with silver hair she refused to die and hands that bore the honest calluses of hard work. She had become an oddity in Millbrook Valley, the widow who'd lost her mind along with her husband. They said it quietly at first, during the autumn when she began digging. Her late husband Thomas had left her the old farmhouse on the edge of town, along with 5 acres of land that most folks considered too stubborn to farm. The soil was rocky, the winters were brutal, and even the summer growing season was unpredictable. But Thomas had also left her with something else, something the neighbors couldn't see. A detailed set of blueprints rolled up in his workshop, bound with a piece of twine and a note that simply read, "For when I'm gone, my love, build our dream." The dream was audacious, perhaps even foolish. An underground greenhouse built into the south-facing slope behind the house, designed to capture and hold warmth even in the deepest winter. Thomas had been an engineer before retirement, and his designs were meticulous, showing calculations for thermal mass, ventilation, and light angles that Margaret barely understood. But she understood his heart, and she understood his faith in her. When she hired young Danny Peterson to help with the excavation, the talk intensified. "She's spending her whole pension on a hole in the ground," said Mrs. Chen at the post office. "Bless her heart. But grief does strange things to people," murmured Pastor Williams. Her own daughter Rachel had driven up from the city, concern etched across her face. "Mom, this is crazy. You can't build something like this yourself. You don't know anything about construction." But Margaret had smiled, that quiet smile that had driven her children mad with frustration their entire lives. "I know enough," she'd said, "and I'm learning the rest." Through October and November she worked. The structure began to take shape. A gentle curve dug 12 feet into the earth, with the front face angled to catch the winter sun. She installed reclaimed windows from an old factory, creating a slanted glass facade that would trap heat like a solar collector. Inside, she built raised beds from salvaged lumber, filled them with a careful mixture of compost, peat, and the rocky soil she'd amended with years of kitchen scraps she'd been saving. The thermal mass came from water barrels painted black, 55-gallon drums she'd gotten free from a food processing plant. They lined the back wall, ready to absorb heat during the day and release it through the cold nights. The neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and amusement. "It'll never work," pronounced Harold Briggs, who fancied himself an expert on everything. "You need electricity for a greenhouse in winter. Heat lamps, grow lights, the whole works. That pit of hers will freeze solid come January." By December, when the first snows fell, Margaret had her greenhouse complete. She'd planted it in late November with cold, hardy varieties: kale, spinach, carrots, beets, winter lettuce, and herbs. She'd even tucked in some experimental tomatoes in the warmest spot, knowing they were a gamble. The structure looked strange, half buried in the hillside, its angled glass face glinting in the winter sun. Some of the younger kids in town called it the Witch's Cave. Their parents didn't correct them. Christmas came and went. Margaret spent it alone as she had the year before. But this time she made herself a salad with lettuce and spinach from her greenhouse. It was a small victory, but it tasted like triumph. January arrived with a vengeance, bringing temperatures that plummeted to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. The town bundled up in grocery store produce. Prices soared as supply chains struggled with weather delays. People waited in line for wilted lettuce shipped from California, paid premium prices for tomatoes that tasted like cardboard, and still they laughed at Margaret. "Heard the widow's still playing farmer in her hole," someone said at the diner. "Wonder when she'll admit defeat and get herself some real groceries like the rest of us." But defeat was the furthest thing from Margaret's mind. Every morning, she'd pull on her boots and trudge through the snow to check her greenhouse. And every morning, miracle of miracles, she found it warm inside, the temperature a steady 50 degrees even when the world outside was frozen solid. The thermal mass was working exactly as Thomas had calculated. The plants were growing slowly but surely, adding precious inches of green to a white world. She didn't tell anyone. There was no point in trying to convince skeptics. She simply tended her plants, whispered encouragement to them, and waited for February. Because Margaret knew something the neighbors didn't. She knew that February was when people's resolve broke, when winter stopped being a cozy inconvenience and became a grinding test of endurance. February was when fresh food became not just expensive but scarce. And February was when her greenhouse would be at its absolute peak, when the increasing daylight would combine with her clever design to create a paradise underground. If you're finding this story inspiring, imagine what else you might discover on our channel. We share stories of determination, ingenuity, and the quiet courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Subscribe now and don't miss the incredible conclusion to Margaret's journey. Sometimes the best victories are the ones nobody sees coming. February came to Millbrook Valley like an unwelcome guest who'd overstayed their welcome. The temperatures didn't just drop, they plummeted into dangerous territory. Schools closed for a week straight. The main road into town was barely passable. The local grocery store started rationing fresh produce, and what little they had looked like it had surrendered to despair days ago. People were surviving on canned goods and frozen dinners, dreaming of the distant spring. And then on a bitter Tuesday morning, everything changed. It started with young Sophie Martinez, who was walking her dog past Margaret's property. The sun was just rising, and Sophie happened to glance toward the greenhouse. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. Through the angled glass, bathed in golden morning light, was an explosion of green, lush, vibrant, impossible green. Tomato plants heavy with fruit, lettuce so crisp it seemed to glow, herbs growing with wild abundance. Sophie pulled out her phone and took a picture, then another. By noon, the image had been shared across every social media group in town. "You're not going to believe what the widow built," read the caption. The first visitor arrived that afternoon. It was Harold Briggs, the same man who'd pronounced her project doomed. He stood at her door, hat literally in hand, looking sheepish. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I may have spoken out of turn. Any chance I could buy some of that lettuce I saw? My wife's been craving a real salad for weeks." Margaret invited him in, made him tea, and sent him home with a bag of mixed greens and some fresh herbs. She didn't charge him a penny. The next day there were 5 people. The day after that, a dozen. They came with cash, with barter offers, with apologies and admiration. Word spread beyond Millbrook Valley. A reporter from the county newspaper arrived. Then someone from the state agricultural extension office. They measured temperatures, examined her system, took notes furiously. "This is remarkable," said Dr. Chen. "The extension agent, no relation to the postmistress. The thermal mass, the angle of the glass, the earth insulation, it's all working together perfectly. You're essentially running a passive solar greenhouse that requires no external energy input. Do you realize how significant this is?" Margaret smiled her quiet smile. "My husband realized it. I just built what he designed." But that wasn't entirely true, and she knew it. Thomas had provided the blueprint, yes, but she had provided something equally important. The courage to build it despite the doubters, the persistence to see it through, and the faith that love could reach across the veil of death to guide her hands. As February wore on and the cold intensified, Margaret's greenhouse became a community treasure. She shared her harvest generously, though she also began selling some of it, enough to recoup her building costs and then some. But more importantly, she began teaching. Every Saturday she held open hours, showing anyone who wanted to learn exactly how the system worked. Danny Peterson, the young man who'd helped with the initial excavation, became a regular fixture. He took measurements, asked questions, and began drawing up his own plans. "I'm going to build one for my parents," he told Margaret, "and maybe start a business building them for other people. This could change everything for folks around here." Margaret's daughter, Rachel, visited in late February, ostensibly to check on her mother, but really to see the miracle for herself. She stood in the greenhouse, surrounded by abundance while snow fell outside, and tears ran down her face. "I should have believed in you," she said. "I should have known you could do this." "You believed what made sense to believe," Margaret said gently. "That's not a failing, sweetheart. It's just being human." But Rachel shook her head. "No, Mom. I've spent my whole life being practical, being sensible, listening to what everyone else says is possible. And you just quietly go about making the impossible real. Dad knew what he was doing when he left you those plans. He knew you were the only one brave enough to build them." The story might have ended there, a simple tale of vindication and success. But Margaret had learned something that winter, something she shared with everyone who visited her greenhouse. It wasn't about proving the doubters wrong. It wasn't even about the vegetables, abundant as they were. It was about the fact that the most important work we do is often the work that makes no sense to anyone else. The work that draws laughter and skepticism. The work that requires us to believe in something we can't yet see. Thomas and I always wanted to farm, she told a group of visitors one Saturday. But life got in the way it does. Careers, children, responsibilities. We kept saying someday. And then he got sick. And suddenly there were no more somedays left. Except he gave me one. One more someday wrapped up in those blueprints. She paused, running her hand along a thriving tomato plant. So when people laughed, I didn't mind. Because I wasn't building this for them. I was building it for every someday that never came. For every dream we postponed. For every plan we made and never executed. This greenhouse, it's not just about growing food. It's about growing faith in yourself, in love, in the possibility that it's never too late to build something beautiful. The visitors were quiet, and more than a few eyes were damp. Outside, February was doing its worst. But inside the greenhouse, spring had already arrived. By the time March came and the worst of winter finally broke, Margaret's underground greenhouse had become something of a legend. 3 more were being built in the county, with a dozen more planned. The Agricultural Extension Office was developing plans to share with farmers. A sustainable living magazine wanted to feature her story, but Margaret just kept tending her plants, and on quiet mornings, when the light slanted through the glass just right, she could swear she felt Thomas there with her, his hand on her shoulder, proud and loving as always. They had laughed at the widow's underground greenhouse. But Margaret had the last laugh, and she shared it generously with everyone who'd finally stopped to listen. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that it's never too late to build your dreams, then you need to subscribe to our channel right now. We bring you real stories of real people who refused to accept limitations, who built the impossible, and who changed their worlds one brave decision at a time. Hit that subscribe button, because the next story we share might just be the inspiration you need to start building your own impossible dream. Don't let your someday slip away.